Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation's third in a series of podcasts, where we're seeking to address the urgent energy topics of today by hearing the opinions and insights from our invited experts. The Al-Attiyah Foundation is an independent think tank aiming to provide robust and practical knowledge and insights on global energy and sustainable development topics, and communicate these for the benefit of the Foundation's members and community. So, the context for today. It's providing access to sustainable energy for all. Now, that is currently one of the top priorities in the global sustainability agenda. The quest for a transition to a less carbon intensive and more sustainable energy system is becoming more urgent, particularly in the face of growing concerns about the impact of climate change. Achieving the desired transformation of the world energy system won't come cheap, though. In its special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 above pre-industrial levels, the IPCC estimated that an annual average investment of around $2.4 trillion in clean energy system would be required between 2016 and 2035 to limit global warming to 1.5. The IPCC made this clarion call for such level of investment after dispelling the previous idea that keeping global warming below 2% this century would make climate change impacts manageable. The conclusion of the special report was that going past the new so-called guardrail of 1.5, which IPCC said could be exceeded by 2030, would be catastrophically dangerous for mankind and the planet. Well, today I'm delighted to welcome our special podcast guest, Professor Michael Grubb, to share his insights on how economically feasible it would be to meet this, daunting energy transformation challenge after this current crash. Michael is Research Director and Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University College London, UCL. He chaired the UK panel of technical experts on electricity market reform from 2016 to 2019. And Professor Grubb is one of the convening lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Michael, a very warm welcome to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast. Hope to make it of interest.
Now, given the fundamental importance of oil and gas to the global economy, how, in your opinion, would the current collapse of oil and gas prices affect the role of these traditional energy sources going forward?
Well, obviously, it's having a huge impact on the fossil fuel industries at present. And I think exactly what it means is going to be very hard to call, because what we're seeing is the clash of 3 or 4 different forces. I think most obviously in the short term, and as we saw in the IEA's report last month, it's led to a remarkable decline in investment in energy across the board, which has collapsed or estimated to collapse about 20%. But within that, oil and gas investment, the IEA estimate's gone down by over 30%, and electricity down by about 10%. So the first force is, what will that reduction in investment do, and how long will that last? Obviously, the second factor is, if oil and gas are much cheaper, then it becomes more competitive. You'd expect people to use more. But then that runs into the tensions with climate change, the agendas that you alluded to, the concerns that using more fossil fuels, particularly of oil and coal, is simply going to clash directly with the ultimately stability of the planet's climate systems. And on that, we have one crisis right in our face, but let's not forget, just the last year, we have seen record impacts and extremes in the Australian bushfires, the Californian fires. I could trot out quite a sizable list of other severe impacts. Even in my home country, the UK, we had the wettest February on record, and now we've just had by far the hottest and driest spring ever seen. So the climatologists are running around thinking, actually, is this panning out worse than we thought? And the final force bearing on this is something of a technology revolution in at least some of the clean technologies. So, anybody who thinks they can predict the outcome of all this thrown in together probably doesn't understand how complicated it is. But we are going to emerge from COVID, I think, with a very much changed energy system.
Yeah, I absolutely second that. Michael, we hear a lot about the use of electricity to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the move to reduce emissions in electricity generation and in some heavy industries is or appears to be difficult. What are those difficulties and how can they be overcome?
So I think electricity is the really interesting and focal sector, partly because it is also seen as a potential driver for reducing emissions in other sectors as well, like most obviously and immediately transport, for which the gains environmentally are very limited unless you first decarbonize the power sector. They're not zero, but. So a lot of effort's gone into the electricity sector. What we've really seen is a very mixed record emerging. To some extent split between the Europe and to a degree US, where there has been some good progress. The UK, as I'm speaking, has just had completed 60 days without coal generation, which has been an astonishing turnaround for a country that used to be known as an island of coal. That's been a combination of policies and technologies. Offshore wind is going very well. We've had actually declining electricity demand, and gas, along with renewables, has taken the strain and taken the market from coal. But if we look east, in a lot of Asia, there's been very limited progress in terms of backing out coal, partly because coal is often seen as the domestic resource, partly it's state backed. And some of it has less access to gas and a less developed renewables industry. So what we're seeing in the power sector is a real, if you'll pardon the pun, power struggle emerging between the forces that know we can decarbonize the power sector and the obstacles that make it really hard, apparently particularly in some of Asia at present.
And certainly in China.
Yeah.
Michael, we hear so much these days about the so-called Green New Deal. Can you share your thoughts with us with what that is and how does it relate? How does it connect to the world energy system?
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. Green New Deal, in my view, started out as a great political slogan. It echoed Roosevelt's New Deal. It put it together with the rising tide of environmental concern and said, hey, there's a positive side to all this if we can invest in new technologies and growth industries, etc. And I think it's still to a degree at a level of merging between rhetoric of that kind and a genuine sense that we know waves of economic growth have, big waves of economic growth have tended to go along with major technological transitions as well, like the rise of the motor car and roads and then the IT revolution. But I think what's exactly under the hood of the Green New Deal has been, frankly, a bit opaque for quite a while. However, beware, political slogans have a way, if they get traction, of starting to turn into something more real. And I think we are seeing that at least in Europe. The European Commission feels it has a strong political mandate and is really starting to turn that rhetoric into more substantive programs of major investment in buildings energy efficiency, acceleration of renewable energy, potentially electrification of the transport sector. And it's beginning to be linked with post-COVID recovery. So that rather than being just a sort of macroeconomic idea around innovation is good for the economy if you can harness it, is becoming much more concrete because it's true, there are quite a lot of jobs in refurbishing the European building stock. Actually, at times of major recession or shock, you've got a lot of underemployed resources, and capital intensive stuff like renewables is actually then quite attractive because you've got a lot of unemployed resource you can bring into bear in sectors which might otherwise be harder to attract. But that then hinges on finance. So
Everything always hinges on finance. What about what about green hydrogen? Does that play a part? Is that part of the Green New Deal?
So 10 years ago, I would have said no. 5, the researchers are talking about it more. And now it is governments talking about hydrogen more. It's still unclear how much they really have a good sense of how tough and complicated this could be. But on the other hand, there are a lot of different tunes that can be played with hydrogen. And that, I think, is one of the attractions. In the first place, it could help to sustain and utilize gas infrastructure. You gradually, I talk about it in terms of, we have wires and electrons. Electrons are neither inherently clean or dirty. It depends how they're made. And you could say the same about the molecules going down a pipeline. And they tend to carry a lot more storage than electrons. So hydrogen plays into that use of infrastructure, and also the fact that it can be generated in various ways, both from renewables when you've got surplus renewables, and obviously from natural gas if you can strip out the carbon, maybe at sites where it's already used in big industrial conversion or LNG transformations. So I definitely see more serious interest in hydrogen, and recently we've also seen Mercedes coming in and talking about hydrogen for trucks, and that is looking increasingly serious. It's still, you might say, moving into industrial experimentation. It's clearly not an established industry, but the big players are clearly sniffing around with growing interest.
Now, you mentioned finance just a few seconds ago, and we're told that the transformation of the world energy system is going to require huge levels of investment at a time when the world is facing serious and possibly prolonged economic downturn. At least that's the forecast, of prolonged economic downturn. Where's the money going to come from?
Well, I mean, this is the trillion-dollar question on many people's minds, not just for the energy sector. And it's a very, very odd one, because we seem in a very strange world now where governments, in our prime minister's, previous prime minister's famous saying, there's no magic money tree. Now that COVID has struck, they seem to have decided there is a magic money tree, at least for a while, required for stimulus packages, and with interest rates so extraordinarily low or negative, partly because of pessimistic outputs, governments are willing to borrow a lot more to try and kickstart economies again, and that means governments are more directly involved in some investments. But at the end of the day, the bulk of the money is still going to have to come from the private sector. And I think many audiences in this podcast are probably closer to many elements of the state-private interface on finance, but definitely I still hear a lot from the private sector finance world. There's still a lot of private capital kicking around wondering where is it safe to invest. Okay. So I think that governments are working out, can they make clean investment a safer place that starts to attract the capital back in?
This podcast is about the economics of transforming to a sustainable energy future. Could you give us a possible time frame before we can transform to that sustainable energy future?
Yeah, it's going to depend on which bits. This is not a problem that's going to get solved overnight. It's one of the problems I have with the sort of climate emergency framing. And in a sense, it is an emergency. But boy, most emergencies don't take decades to deal with. This one will. That said, I think we will see it in waves. I do think there is now a good prospect that we will see radical transformation in the power sector over roughly the next decade. I see that happening before my eyes. We now see that over 65% of investment in the electricity sector is going into renewables. That's radically different from what we saw before. The volumes in megawatt hours are still fairly modest, but it's dominating the new investment. And that to me is a clear sign coal is dying in Europe and the US. It doesn't matter how much Trump talks about protecting US coal, it ain't coming back as far as we can see. The question again is how quickly do things start to change in the major emerging economies? I was in Korea and Japan early February. I know China fairly well. A lot of the coal investment is state backed. Most of the renewables is private sector. So how will that political tension play out? We don't really know. All I'm saying is the power sector, in my view, will look radically different in a decade. And I think those who've clung on to coal will find that they're losing their shirts.
So, what kind of impact will that have on climate change? You're heavily involved
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
yeah.
Are policymakers giving serious consideration to your recommendations or the recommendations that come from the IPCC?
It always depends on where you are, depends, what you see. Um, I'm also conscious there's still quite strong regional components in this. One of my old colleagues in the gas industry said, Europeans forget. Go to an energy industry in a conference in Europe. Climate change is always going to be on the agenda. It's always going to be a big part of the conversation. Go to the same industry conference in Asia, and it may get paid a little bit of lip service on the side, but it's not a central issue.
Or maybe America?
And in America, you mention it, and it's immediately politicized in highly bipartisan ways. And we don't know where the chips will fall, either in terms of obviously the presidential election, but also the ongoing struggle between states and Washington. And California has effectively declared independence on its energy policy, and so is New York State. But there's continual struggles going on in the US. I think the bigger play really is how quickly does this pan out in Asia, and that is frankly hard to call. Do I think the world will hit 1.5? No, that's an incredibly ambitious objective, and it always was. I think the latest analyses I see coming from the scientists are we're closer to that cliff edge than we feared, and from the economics is to turn around these massive industrial systems that fast would require something close to a wartime effort. On the other hand, the Paris Agreement basically says governments will secure well below 2 degrees and strive towards 1.5. That is still within reach. That still implies some radical changes in the energy sector over the next couple of decades. It still means that we've got to get pretty close to net zero emissions by 2050, 2060. Now, I know to a lot in the industry that seems miles away, but when you start tracking it back, you need to change the electricity sector, you need to roll out electricity through transport, you need to deal with energy intensive industries. Those things take time.
And
we're seeing
time is something we don't have, and also because the politicians that make the decisions today won't be around in 2050 and 60. But if we are going to be serious at the moment about climate change and using fossil fuels, when do you see carbon capture being commercially viable? Does that require a steep carbon tax, for example?
Well, I think one of the big dilemmas around carbon capture is it does feel like a technology that's been talked with a lot of promise for actually several decades. The technology has not moved nearly as fast as we hoped. And I think that's partly because the industry is aware that unlike renewables, which are something radically new, therefore a bit of a threat, but also hard to judge and with a lot of potential for innovation, which we've now seen, particularly in the dramatic solar and wind. Carbon capture and storage is something they know can only be economic if there's a serious carbon price or other direct support. Because, of course, it costs more to run a power plant with a big CCS unit on the back than to just run the power plant without that, right? More investment and it reduces the efficiency of the plant. So it's not going to happen unless there's a strong government support or carbon price. And I think industry has been skeptical about how much will that happen. So that slowed down investment. And I think the jury's still a little bit out. It may be that as we get closer to that, in fact, I would say very likely in the power sector, we discover smarter ways of decarbonising power generation than sticking a whole lot more equipment on the back of an inherently emitting source. I think in other sectors it's harder to see. I think in cement, steel, some of those heavy industries, I think that's where we really see carbon capture and storage coming into play. And then it will become part of, if you like, a petrochemicals or chemicals complex, which is also trying to use the captured carbon in smarter ways. So it's not quite just, you strip it out and bury it. You try and do something a little bit more economically attractive than that.
Finally, Michael, it was recently decided the next Conference of Parties under the UN Convention, COP26, would be deferred until next year, next November. Does that represent a setback for you? And you talked briefly about the disconnect in the States, but what about the role of the US and its rejection of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah. Well, there's quite a lot wrapped up in that question, as others. Maybe first I'll start on the US one. It was always one of the risks in the system that the US has actually historically been very capricious on climate change. Its history for the last 25, 30 years has been signing up to agreement that is then repudiated after a change of party, a presidency. And the rest of the world is actually rather sick of that. And it's been made pretty clear the Paris Agreement was negotiated with the US, with the rest of the world bending over backwards to give the US everything it asked for. And if a Republican presidency can't live with that, the answer is, well, we're sorry, but this is the agreement, and this is the one that is going ahead. We are seeing the formation of alliances in the US at state levels, trying to seek legal ways that states could, in effect, join or be accessions to the Paris Agreement, because most of the implementation is at state level. Various states and cities have declared they will adhere to the Paris goals, whatever the president does. But I mean, of course, that complicates things a lot. Where it could have complicated things most of all is COP26 was due to take place the week after the presidential election, which would not have been a very helpful situation. Partly because it meant everybody preparing would have had to prepare for two radically different outcomes. And in the midst of COVID, to be honest, I think the British government was not unhappy to have a lot more time to prepare. It was messing up the diplomatic agendas. Diplomats had to be called back home. They couldn't have all of the usual phenomenal degree of build-up that goes into any successful UN summit. Successful UN summits are built upon years of diplomacy. Everybody knows what the crunch issues and the key deals might be by the time they arrive. They're in the midst of COVID and without having a clue where the US would land, those preparations were almost impossible. So although it sounds a paradox, climate change is really urgent, but it's the kind of, this is really important, and haste was getting in the way of urgency of finding a workable agenda even. What the British government is now doing with the extra time is saying, this one's going to be different. This is not going to be a big round of trying to push countries to stronger pledges. That will be nice, but what really matters is the implementation of what's already been agreed as the precursor for strengthening it. And so the British government has now changed the agenda and is going to have 18 months to persuade countries that we're now in a world about transforming multiple industrial sectors. And that's what they want to focus on at COP26. And now I think they've got time to do it. Frankly, personally, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Michael. Professor Michael Grubb, for your insights and your time today. With dozens more countries still enforcing full or part lockdowns in response to this pandemic, A wide range of indicators are showing how transport use, electricity demand, industrial activity, as we all know, they're all being cut. So if there is one
Yeah.
positive green note in this pandemic, it is that emissions are being cut, and estimated in the region of 2,000 million tons of CO2. So possibly a greener summer, not in Britain a particularly dry summer, possibly, if ever. It's estimated the virus could trigger the largest ever annual fall in CO2 emissions. That's more than any other previous economic crisis or period of war. So that may well be good for you and for the Green lobby, but it means, reflects some harder times ahead, sadly, for oil and gas producers. So today we
Stephen,
see
maybe
that,
I just a very quick add. It's not the way we would like to cut emissions, but it may clear some things out a little bit, which enable some interesting changes longer term, and maybe some interesting habitual changes. But this is not the way we would like to cut emissions.
I understand that. Fair enough. All right. Well, I'll go out and smell the roses. Indeed, today we see that we live in interesting times, as the Chinese say, and they're filled with life-changing challenges. Thank you again, Michael. Watch this space for the next in the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast series. I'm Stephen Cole. Thank you and goodbye.